Ethics for Research Involving Human Subjects. Module 3, Informed Consent and Assessing Risk. Diane Paul, MS-RN, The Cancer Institute of New Jersey, Tracy Arwood, MS, Clemson University, and Sanjita Panikkar, Ph.D., American Psychological Association. There is consensus regarding the importance of informed consent. Informed consent is how you show respect to research subjects, and it is mandated by the Code of Federal Regulations to protect human subjects or volunteers, ensure the potential study subjects clearly understand the benefits and risks associated with their participation in a study, provide the potential study subjects with all information needed to reach a decision on whether or not to participate in a research study. The Code of Federal Regulations is published in the Federal Register, a publication of the federal government that codifies the general and permanent rules of executive departments and agencies. There are 50 titles that represent broad areas subject to federal regulation. The Code of Federal Regulations is updated once each calendar year and is issued on a quarterly basis. The framework for informed consent can be found in the Code of Federal Regulations, and legally appropriate informed consent will include the following general requirements. 1. Information that the study involves research. 2. A clear description of the risks or discomforts to the subject. 3. A description of the benefits to the subject or to others. 4. A disclosure of any alternative procedures or treatments that may be advantageous to the subject. 5. A description explaining how the institution or investigator will maintain confidentiality of records. 6. For research involving more than minimal risk, an explanation should describe whether there will be any compensation. 7. The specific office, name, and telephone numbers of whom to contact for further information regarding the research subject's rights, the research study, or for research-related injury. 8. A statement that participation is voluntary, that refusal to participate involves no penalty or loss of benefits to which the person is otherwise entitled, and that the subject may discontinue at any time. Additional requirements. In addition, if relevant to the research, legally effective informed consent will also include the following elements. 1. A statement that the procedure may involve unforeseeable risks. 2. When appropriate, include a statement that the research could involve unforeseeable risks to the embryo or fetus, or to the subject if the subject is or becomes pregnant. 3. A description of circumstances under which the subject's participation may be terminated by the investigator without the subject's consent. 4. A description of any additional costs to the subject that may result from participation in the research. 5. A clear statement of the consequences of a subject's decision to withdraw from the research and, if so, how to withdraw safely. 6. A statement that significant new findings developed during research which may relate to the subject's willingness to continue will be provided to the subject. 7. A description of the approximate number of subjects that will be involved in the study. Regulatory groups. Compliance with informed consent regulations is regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, Title 21, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 50, Office for Human Research Protections, Title 45, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 46, Study Institutions Institutional Review Board. Obtaining informed consent involves providing information to the subject, ensuring the subject understands by answering questions the subject may have, obtaining the voluntary agreement of the subject to participate in the study. Providing information. Guidelines for providing information include: advertising cannot be coercive or make false promises or claims. The information should be communicated in a manner and language that is clear and understandable. The information communicated should not use exculpatory language either in the written consent or in discussions about the research. Procedures to screen potential subjects for eligibility must protect the rights and welfare of prospective subjects. Ensuring understanding. Guidelines for ensuring understanding include: proving consent in a language that is understandable to the subject and his or her representative. Providing non-English speaking subjects a translated informed consent document that is accurate as determined by the IRB. If a translator is used, providing a written translation of the consent document is still required. Giving the person enough time to think about their research before consenting to research study participation. Obtaining voluntary agreement to participate. Legally effective informed consent shall be obtained from the subject or the subject's legally authorized representative, be obtained under circumstances that provide the subject with an opportunity to consider whether or not to participate and that minimize coercive influences, not include any language through which the subject is made to waive or appear to waive any of his or her legal rights, or any language that releases the investigator, sponsor, or institution from liability for negligence. Coercive tactics such as inappropriate financial or other rewards cannot be used. Language issues. The consent process should be conducted in the language spoken by the subject, and the consent form should be translated into that language. An IRB may require independent confirmation of the accuracy of the translation. Subjects who are not literate in their language must have an interpreter present to explain the study to the subject and translate questions and answers between the subject and investigator. Cultural issues. Issues other than literacy may affect comprehension. For example, in some cultures, it may be considered rude to ask questions of an investigator-researcher, or rude to decline what is perceived of as a request for a favor. In these circumstances, the questions of who conducts the consent process and how it is explained become even more important. Sometimes, under specific circumstances with IRB approval, informed consent can be waived. The Department of Health and Human Services allows an institutional review board to waive or change the requirements for informed consent under two sets of circumstances: government projects and general waivers and alterations. Government projects allow informed consent to be waived if the research or project is approved and/or conducted by state or local government and is meant to study or evaluate A, a program to benefit the public, B, procedures under those programs, C, alternatives to those programs or procedures, D, changes in payment methods or levels for the services of those programs, E, the research could not practicably be carried out without the waiver. General waivers and alterations are permissible if the IRB determines that A, the research involves no more than minimal risk to subjects, B, the waiver or alteration will not adversely affect the rights and welfare of the subjects, C, the research could not practicably be carried out without the waiver or alteration, D, whenever appropriate, the subjects will be provided with additional pertinent information after participation. The Food and Drug Administration 21 Code of Federal Regulations 50.23 and 50.24 provide exceptions to the requirement for informed consent under the following circumstances. In situations where requirements for exception from informed consent are met for emergency research. In life-threatening conditions involving an individual subject where requirements for an exception from informed consent are met and include documentation of all of the following. The investigator, with the concurrence of another physician, believes the situation necessitates the use of a test article, in other words, an investigational drug, device, or biologic. The subject and/or legally authorized representative is unable to communicate consent. FDA definition of legally authorized representative: an individual or judicial or other body authorized under applicable law to consent on behalf of a prospective subject to the subject's participation in the procedure or procedures involved in the research. There is insufficient time to obtain consent. No alternative exists that will provide an equal or better chance of saving the subject's life. Signed consent may be waived and oral consent used under the following circumstances. The Food and Drug Administration allows waiver of documented informed consent when study participation presents minimal risk to the subject and the research involves no procedures requiring consent outside the context of participation in a research study. The IRB may require the investigator to provide the subject with written materials about the research. When obtaining consent from a legally authorized representative who is not able to provide signed consent in person, it is acceptable to send the informed consent document to the representative by facsimile and conduct the consent interview by telephone. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, an IRB may allow waiver of a signed consent document in either of the following circumstances. The consent would be the only link between the research and the subject, and the principal risk to the subject would be due to a breach of confidentiality, and each subject will be asked if they want consent to be documented. Study participation presents minimal risk of harm to the subject, and the research involves no procedures requiring consent outside the context of participation in a research study. Is telephone consent from a legally authorized representative appropriate? A verbal approval does not satisfy the requirement for a signed consent document, as outlined in the Code of Regulations. However, it is acceptable to send the informed consent document to the legally authorized representative by facsimile and conduct the consent interview by telephone when the representative can read the consent as it is discussed. If the representative agrees, he or she can sign the consent and return the signed document to the clinical investigator by facsimile. One of the most important and challenging tasks that investigators face is identifying and evaluating risks associated with participation in research. Unlike biomedical research studies or clinical trials, in which the sources of risk may be more readily identifiable and quantifiable, risks associated with participation in social and behavioral science research are often more elusive and less predictable. However, this does not mean that these risks are any less serious or less real. For example, discrimination due to an inadvertent disclosure of sensitive personal information, such as sexual orientation or a diagnosis of mental illness, could have serious consequences. In rare circumstances, the risks associated with social and behavioral sciences may be physical in nature and not trivial. For example, physical harassment or arrest was identified as a risk in a study of the black market economy in Cuba. Similarly, those who study victims of domestic violence need to consider that their subjects may become the victims of retaliatory violence. It is also possible that when groups or communities rather than individuals are the focus of a study, the group as a whole may be at risk of harm. For example, studies comparing the average IQ of racial groups or the prevalence of HIV-infected individuals in communities may stigmatize the community being studied. Risks in social and behavioral sciences generally fall in three categories: invasion of privacy, breach of confidentiality, study procedure. Invasions of privacy can occur if personal information is accessed or collected without the subject's knowledge or consent. Invasions of privacy can occur if a subject's participation in a study is revealed without the subject's knowledge. For example, if an investigator communicates via email with subjects in a study about recovering from childhood sexual assault, family members with access to email may learn about the assault. Breach of confidentiality is perhaps the primary source of risk in the social and behavioral sciences. Information obtained by researchers could harm subjects if disclosed outside the research setting. Confidentiality can be compromised through an unauthorized release of data, which could have a negative impact on the subject's psychological, social, or economic status. For example, an unintended disclosure of a subject's HIV status could result in the subject's loss of employment or health insurance coverage. Public revelations of data collected about sexual preference could result in a loss of social status or discrimination in housing or employment. Workers asked to reveal their attitudes about the effectiveness of their managers could lose their jobs or be denied promotions if the information is not adequately protected. Information about illegal activities or status, drug use or immigrant status, can have serious legal consequences for subjects. Study procedures, in some cases, can put subjects at risk by simply participating in the research. For example, responding to questions about a sensitive topic or traumatic event may be distressing to a subject, even if the information divulged is kept in strict confidence. Another situation in which merely participating in research might pose some risk to subjects is when there is a potential for a breach of confidentiality, not because of inadequate confidentiality procedures on the part of the research team, but from subjects themselves when data is collected in a group setting, such as a focus group. Even though participants are typically cautioned not to share information outside the data collection setting, subjects should be made aware that the researcher cannot guarantee confidentiality. When assessing risk associated with participation in a research study, there are two distinct elements of risk that need to be considered. One is the probability of harm, the likelihood that a specific harm might occur. Not all possible harms are equally probable, and this fact should be taken into consideration when assessing risk. The second element of risk is the magnitude of such harm. Sometimes there is great disparity between the probability and the magnitude of harm in a study. For example, a researcher wants to do a web-based survey of college students to elicit information about their sexual behavior and drug use. Identifiers will not be collected. However, the data are vulnerable in transit from an individual's PC to the web server hosting the survey, much in the same way credit card information is vulnerable during transit. Although the probability that the data could be snatched in transit and identified is low, it could be done. The magnitude of the possible harm is very high given the sensitivity of the information. Risks in research participation are specific to time, situation, and culture. Thus, what may be a socially sensitive issue or topic at one time or place may not be so at another time or place. For example, asking women if they have had abortions would carry very different risks in a country where abortion is a routine medical practice, a country where it is illegal, and a country in which it is legal but the issue is fraught with religious and political controversy. Risks will differ according to the subject population, too. Consider this case. A study on the efficacy of a behavioral intervention for smoking cessation involves both adults and teenagers. Purchasing tobacco products is generally illegal for persons under 18 years of age. For adults, however, it is a health hazard but not an illegal activity. Thus, any assessment of the risk for teenagers will have to consider that the research focuses on an illegal activity. People, including researchers, tend to underestimate risks involved in activities with which they are familiar, and to overestimate the benefit of things that are important to them. Thus, an independent assessment of risk is critical. One function of institutional review boards is to provide this independent assessment. Regardless of the true probability of harm, research indicates that when potential harms are severe, people tend to overestimate the probability. And when potential harms are less severe, such as embarrassment, people tend to underestimate the probability. A good consent process will address these tendencies. Federal regulations, based on the ethical principle of beneficence, require that risks associated with research be reasonable in relation to the anticipated benefits. A great deal of research in the social and behavioral sciences offers little potential for direct benefits to the subjects themselves. The benefits of the research often lie in the importance of the knowledge to be gained, the contribution it makes to science, or the contributions to society in general. There might also be cases in which a specific community, rather than individual subjects, benefits from the research. On the other hand, most research in the social and behavioral sciences poses little or no risk to the subject. Federal regulations also stipulate that potential risks must be minimized to the extent possible, consistent with sound research design. When a possible disclosure of subjects' responses is the primary source of potential harm, collecting data anonymously provides the best protection. For example, a mail survey can be constructed without a follow-up procedure, thereby negating the need for identifiers. If, however, the study design makes the collection of identifiers necessary, for example, a longitudinal study, safeguarding the data from unauthorized access can be accomplished in various ways, including 1. Remove all direct identifiers as soon as possible. 2. Substitute codes for identifiers. 3. Maintain code lists and data files in separate secure locations. 4. Use accepted methods to protect against indirect identification, such as aggregate reporting or pseudonyms. 5. Use and protect computer passwords. 6. Encrypt stored data. 7. Access and store data on computers without Internet connections. Certificates of confidentiality are issued by the National Institutes of Health to protect identifiable research information from forced disclosure. Certificates of confidentiality may be secured for any research, regardless of funding. The research does not have to be funded by National Institutes of Health. Subjects may be placed at risk simply by being involved in a study on a stigmatizing or illegal activity. One way to diminish their risk of exposure is to consider applying to the IRB for a waiver of documentation of consent if the consent form is the only document that links the participants to the study. A waiver of documentation of consent does not imply that any of the required elements of consent are waived. The elements of consent must be provided in some fashion, such as in a cover letter, informational sheet, or verbal script. It may be necessary to find ways to guard against subjects being observed participating in a study. For example, if an investigator is conducting a case study of a gang member, it may be necessary to find places to meet where other members of the gang could not observe the interaction. Subjects may also be placed at risk by the nature of the inquiry. Studies on strategies for recovery from post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, may involve a complete assessment of the nature and impact of the trauma. In research that has the potential to be distressing to the subjects, investigators need to plan appropriate resources such as supportive counseling, referral, or access to research staff. Potential research subjects need to be given sufficient information to make a decision about whether they are willing to accept potential risks. If questions will be of sensitive nature, subjects need to be forewarned. Subjects also need to know what steps will be taken to protect confidential information, including disposition of recorded material. Any limits to the extent to which a researcher can protect identifiable personal information should be clearly explained. State and local laws may limit confidentiality, such as reporting requirements for child and elder abuse. Confidentiality cannot be guaranteed for information shared in a focus group. When assessing risk, focusing on the research methodology and/or topic alone is insufficient, since it neglects to take into account another source of risk, that associated with findings or impact of the research results on subjects themselves or specific groups or communities. Common social and behavioral science methodologies, such as surveys, questionnaires, and interviews, are considered, sometimes erroneously, low risk, since they do not involve physically invasive procedures with associated risk of physical harm. However, it is not the procedures per se that engender potential harm, but the interaction of different elements, including the research topic and the population being studied.